The following documentary contains disturbing accounts of sexual abuse, institutional betrayal, and systemic corruption. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. This story is based entirely on real events, court records, and investigative journalism. It is not intended for children or sensitive audiences. If you or someone you know is a survivor of abuse, please know that you are not alone. Help is available. Prisons are built to keep society safe. Their purpose is simple: lock away those who have done harm, isolate them, and create order where chaos once reigned. But what happens when the danger isn't locked behind the bars, but carries the keys? At California's Central California Women's Facility, the largest women's prison in the state, that nightmare became reality. For nearly a decade, one man wore the uniform of a correctional officer, patrolled the cell blocks, and collected a paycheck from the state. But beneath that uniform, he was something else entirely: a predator hiding in plain sight. His name was Gregory Rodriguez. From 2014 to 2023, he abused his position of power to sexually exploit at least 9 women. Women who were already behind bars, already stripped of their freedom, and already at their most vulnerable. He didn't need to stalk them on the outside. They were trapped, dependent on him for food, movement, and dignity. He used gum, candy, tobacco, harmless items on the outside, but inside those walls they were currency, tokens of survival. And then came the threats: solitary confinement, retaliation, punishments. For nearly a decade, Rodriguez preyed on the women he was meant to guard. In 2025, justice finally caught up with him. Rodriguez was sentenced to an astonishing 224 years in prison. A sentence designed to send a message, not just to him, but to an entire system that had ignored its own darkest truth. This is not just the story of one man. It is the story of how silence protects abusers, how institutions fail those in their care, and how even behind bars, the most terrifying monsters are sometimes the ones entrusted with the keys. Prisons are built to keep society safe. Their purpose is simple: lock away those who have done harm, isolate them, and create order where chaos once reigned. But what happens when the danger isn't locked behind the bars, but carries the keys? At California's Central California Women's Facility, the largest women's prison in the state, that nightmare became reality. For nearly a decade, one man wore the uniform of a correctional officer, patrolled the cell blocks, and collected a paycheck from the state. But beneath that uniform, he was something else entirely: a predator hiding in plain sight. His name was Gregory Rodriguez. From 2014 to 2023, he abused his position of power to sexually exploit at least 9 women. Women who were already behind bars, already stripped of their freedom, and already at their most vulnerable. He didn't need to stalk them on the outside. They were trapped, dependent on him for food, movement, and dignity. He used gum, candy, tobacco, harmless items on the outside, but inside those walls they were currency, tokens of survival. And then came the threats: solitary confinement, retaliation, punishments. For nearly a decade, Rodriguez preyed on the women he was meant to guard. In 2025, justice finally caught up with him. Rodriguez was sentenced to an astonishing 224 years in prison. A sentence designed to send a message, not just to him, but to an entire system that had ignored its own darkest truth. This is not just the story of one man. It is the story of how silence protects abusers, how institutions fail those in their care, and how even behind bars, the most terrifying monsters are sometimes the ones entrusted with the keys. The Central California Women's Facility, located in the small farming town of Chowchilla, is a sprawling compound surrounded by dry fields and highways. With over 2,000 inmates, it is the largest women's prison in the state of California, a fortress of concrete, metal, and control. Life inside is strict, predictable, and suffocating. Inmates live under constant surveillance, with every movement regulated. Correctional officers decide when you eat, when you sleep, and even whether you get access to small comforts like shampoo, candy, or a stick of gum. These items, trivial on the outside, but inside those walls, they were currency, tokens of survival. Correctional officers have immense power. They are not just guards, they are gatekeepers. They can decide whether you are written up for punishment, whether you get solitary confinement, whether your requests for medical attention are honored or ignored. For women incarcerated at Chowchilla, every guard has the power to make life just a little easier or much, much harder. Gregory Rodriguez was one of those guards. To the outside world, he was just another officer, middle-aged, a steady job, a uniform that commanded respect. But inside the prison, whispers began to spread. Rodriguez wasn't just enforcing the rules, he was bending them, twisting them, using them for his own desires. At first, it was subtle. He would linger a little too long near certain women, offer them gum or candy in exchange for small favors. In a world where every small gesture can feel like salvation, some women felt they had no choice but to accept. Others quickly realized there was nothing kind about Rodriguez's attention. Behind the steel doors, safety is supposed to be absolute. But for many women at Chowchilla, the walls that were meant to keep danger out had only locked it in. Rodriguez wore the uniform. He carried the keys. And the system trusted him to maintain order. Instead, he turned that order into terror. Gregory Rodriguez was not the kind of predator who struck suddenly in an explosion of violence. His abuse was quiet, calculated, patient. For years, he built his control on something deceptively simple: trust. In a prison, even the smallest gesture from an officer can feel like a lifeline, a candy bar, a stick of gum, a word of kindness. To a woman living in a world where every move is restricted, those gestures carried immense weight. Rodriguez learned to weaponize those tokens. He would offer them selectively, testing boundaries. If a woman accepted, he pressed further. If she resisted, he reminded her, with a smirk, a threat, or a denial of something she needed, that he held the keys to her world. The prison hierarchy gave him absolute authority. He could write disciplinary reports that would add weeks or months to a woman's sentence. He could deny access to visits, to phone calls, to yard time. He could place a woman in solitary confinement, the prison within the prison, where 23 hours a day are spent in isolation. Every woman knew it, and Rodriguez knew they knew it. His abuse grew bolder. It was no longer just gum or candy slipped under the radar. It became explicit demands, sexual favors in exchange for protection, intimate acts in exchange for the chance to avoid punishment. Sometimes he orchestrated encounters in blind spots of the prison, laundry rooms, supply closets, corners where cameras couldn't reach. Other times, he simply used his authority to order women into spaces where no one else was watching. Survivors later described the encounters in court. Some spoke of being cornered, their pleas ignored. Others described the shame of being forced into silence, terrified that if they spoke up, they would be punished, not him. And for nearly a decade, that's exactly what happened. Rodriguez operated in the open, but the prison walls became his shield. He wasn't lurking in darkness. He was hiding behind the uniform, a predator disguised as protection. To the outside world, Gregory Rodriguez was an officer doing his job. Inside Chowchilla, he was something far more sinister, the embodiment of every incarcerated woman's fear. Because in prison, when the person meant to guard you becomes the monster, there is nowhere left to run.
Prison is a place built on silence. Every woman inside knows this. You don't make too much noise. You don't draw too much attention. And when you do speak up, your words are filtered through layers of authority. Officers, supervisors, administrators, all with the power to erase your voice. The women at Chowchilla tried to fight that silence. They filed complaints against Gregory Rodriguez. They wrote down what he had done, the places he had cornered them, the threats he had whispered. Each complaint was supposed to be logged, reviewed, investigated. That's how the system is meant to work. But instead, something else happened. Their complaints vanished. Sometimes they were ignored outright, tossed into a drawer and forgotten. Other times, the women who spoke up were labeled as liars, as troublemakers, as inmates trying to manipulate the system for attention. And the punishment came swiftly. Some women who reported Rodriguez were written up for disciplinary infractions. Others were transferred to different housing units, isolated from the few friends they trusted. Still others were threatened with solitary confinement, the punishment every inmate dreads. Imagine being locked in a concrete box for 23 hours a day, with no sunlight, no human contact, just your thoughts echoing in silence. That was the punishment held over their heads. Speak up and you could end up there. Stay silent and maybe, just maybe, Rodriguez would leave you alone. The message was clear: protect yourself or protect the truth. You couldn't do both. Investigations later revealed that dozens of complaints about staff misconduct had been filed at California's women's prisons. And yet, in all that time, only a handful of officers had ever been fired. Rodriguez wasn't the first, and he wasn't the only one. But he was allowed to keep working, keep patrolling, keep praying because the institution valued its image over its inmates. For the women trapped inside, it was a second betrayal. First by the man who wore the badge, then by the system that was supposed to hold him accountable. Each ignored complaint, each punishment for speaking out wasn't just silence. It was complicity. It was permission for Rodriguez to continue. And so he did. For nearly a decade, he moved through the prison with impunity, knowing that the voices of his victims would be swallowed by the walls around them. But silence cannot last forever, and in 2023, that silence finally broke. In 2023, the walls of Chowchilla could no longer contain the truth. Investigative journalists uncovered the allegations, speaking to survivors who risked everything to tell their stories. Their accounts were chilling, detailed, impossible to ignore. One by one, they described how Rodriguez used gum, candy, and tobacco as currency for control. How he cornered them in blind spots. How he leveraged threats of punishment to silence them. These were not isolated stories, they were patterns repeated across years, across housing units, across lives. The exposé hit the public like a thunderclap. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about a culture of abuse inside California's women's prisons. A culture where complaints disappeared, where survivors were punished, and where predators could thrive in uniform. The revelation sparked outrage. Activists demanded answers. Families of incarcerated women held vigils outside prison gates, holding signs that read, "Believe women behind bars." The pressure grew until the Department of Justice stepped in. A federal civil rights investigation was launched, examining not just Rodriguez, but the entire system that had enabled him. Federal officials wanted to know, how could a man abuse women for nearly a decade in a prison full of staff, supervisors, and supposed safeguards without being stopped? For the survivors, the investigation was validation, proof that their voices finally mattered. But it was also a painful reminder of how long they had been ignored. Their cries had echoed for years. Only now, with the weight of federal attention and public scrutiny, were they being heard. Rodriguez was no longer just a guard at Chowchilla. He was a symbol of what happens when institutions prioritize protection of their own over the people they serve. And with the investigation came something Rodriguez had evaded for nearly 10 years: accountability. The trial was over. The sentence had been delivered. Gregory Rodriguez would spend the rest of his life and more behind bars. For many, it felt like justice. But for the women who lived through his abuse, the scars remain. Survivors described feeling conflicted. On one hand, they had been believed at last. Their words, once buried by paperwork and retaliation, had finally been heard in open court. But on the other hand, the years of silence, the years of being ignored, could never be erased. Justice delayed is justice denied. And what about the system? The Department of Justice launched a civil rights investigation into California's women's prisons, examining not just Rodriguez, but the culture that had enabled him. Why were complaints ignored? Why were survivors punished for speaking out? Why did it take nearly a decade and the intervention of federal authorities to bring one man to justice? The answers remain uncomfortable. Institutions protect themselves. They protect their image, and too often they protect abusers instead of victims. Rodriguez may be gone, but the system that enabled him still stands. Other survivors continue to come forward, not just in California, but across the United States. Their stories echo the same themes: silence, retaliation, neglect. The predator may change, but the pattern remains. The Rodriguez case was more than one man's downfall. It was a mirror held up to an entire system, a reminder that abuse flourishes in silence, and silence thrives in institutions built on power without accountability. For the women at Chowchilla, justice came too late. But their courage in speaking out has forced a reckoning that may protect others in the future. Their pain, their testimony, their bravery, these are the reasons Rodriguez is now behind bars. Rodriguez was once trusted to keep order. Instead, he created terror. For nearly 10 years, he wore the badge of a protector while preying on those he was sworn to guard. His sentence, 224 years, ensures he will never walk free again. But numbers cannot erase trauma. Years cannot undo pain. And justice in the courtroom cannot erase injustice in the world. Behind bars, the guard became the predator, and the system proved that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are not the ones locked away, but the ones holding the keys.